Hello, and welcome to the First Unitarian Church of Salt Lake City, gathering once more in virtual worship. We welcome you, whether you are here in Salt Lake or joining us from points afar. We're coming to you once again from our own homes, supported by a wonderful team of tech wizards who are helping us to make the invisible visible and make love real as we create this worship experience for you. This week, on Wednesday, we are celebrating Earth Day. This year is the 50th anniversary of the very first Earth Day, which was celebrated in 1970. Now, for some of you who are very young, that might seem like a really long time ago. But Earth Day is just as important now as it was in 1970. It comes at a time each year when we, here in the Northern Hemisphere, are celebrating spring, new life, blooming flowers, and warmer days. Of course, our friends in the Southern Hemisphere are celebrating colder days. But no matter what season Earth Day arrives, this is a day when we all remember that we belong to the earth, that the earth is our home, and that each one of us has a responsibility to take care of the earth. For Unitarian Universalists, that might remind you of one of our 7 principles. Young friends, which principle am I thinking of? Well, if you said the 7th principle, you are right. Our 7th principle says that as you use, we promise to take care of the interconnected web of all living things, plants, animals, humans, all things. Everything is connected, and everything depends on every other thing. So what that means is that if we trash the earth by polluting our air, water, or soil, we end up hurting other living creatures, even if they are creatures we didn't even know exist. But if we take care of our air, water, soil, and other natural resources, then we nourish other creatures. And that ends up being good for us human animals as well. So every year on Earth Day, I make one commitment to do something different during the next year to make my footsteps on the earth a little bit lighter. One year, I committed to not smashing bugs because they are living creatures. Even if they might be ugly or scary, they do important jobs in our environment. One year, I stopped using plastic bags and switched over to cloth bags that can be washed and reused. There are lots of things that you can do. You can cut back on how much meat you eat, because raising animals for meat is really hard on the land where they live. You can decide not to drink from plastic bottles anymore. Or you can choose to walk or ride your bike instead of driving your car. Whether you are 9 years old or 90 years old, I challenge you to make one change this year that helps take care of the earth. I bet you'll feel better for it. And hey, let me know what your one change is. Maybe I will be inspired by you, and I'll make that change too. When we all work together, we can make the earth a much happier place to live. Well, once again, welcome to our worship service. Let's begin as we always do by lighting our chalice. And if you have a chalice at home, maybe you'd like to light it now too.
Symbol of light, symbol of knowledge, symbol of warmth, symbol of freedom. We light this chalice as a symbol of our faith. Here we gather to celebrate hope and the infinite possibilities of love. Good morning. So here it is, Earth Day. Oftentimes, I think when we think about Earth Day and some of the huge problems that face our world with its ecology and our presence on it, It seems like some of the challenges are huge and overwhelming. But I think that every once in a while, if we think about the little things we can do, they can have as much importance as the big things that need to be done. Maybe it's like picking up some garbage in your neighborhood as you're walking down the sidewalk, or perhaps rather than saving the entire ocean, we can just feed a few little animals and take care of them in our neighborhoods or maybe in a park close by. For our opening hymn today, I want to do a song that's one of my favorite songs out of Mary Poppins. Some of you might remember it when there's an old woman sitting on the stairs of a great big cathedral in London. Before we sing it through, I want to just maybe explain a couple of things for the younger folks so that it'll help make a little more sense. That big cathedral that she's sitting on the stairs at is called St. Paul's, and it's a very, very huge cathedral in London. And that St. Paul is mentioned in the song, as are the statues that are up around the top, where they say that there are the statues of the saints and the apostles. That's making reference to those statues that are all up around the top of St. Paul. The other word that you might not know, when she's selling little bags of bird food to feed the birds, and she says tuppence, tuppence, tuppence a bag. And tuppence is a very, very small amount of money, like a penny. It's a tiny, tiny little bit of money. So she says, just spend a little bit of money so that you can feed the birds.
Earlier this week in our UU history class, we were talking about Ralph Waldo Emerson and the Transcendentalists and how their attitudes about nature changed the way Unitarians thought about God. After Emerson, Unitarians would never again feel that God could only be found in the dark and dusty confines of a church pew. Emerson reminded us that God is everywhere, and especially in nature. What better time than Earth Day to rediscover Emerson and to rediscover God's presence in the natural world? So I thought I'd read you just a little bit of Mr. Emerson's famous essay titled nature. The lover of nature is that person whose inward and outward senses are still truly adjusted to each other, who has retained the spirit of infancy even into the era of adulthood. Their intercourse with heaven and earth becomes part of their daily food. In the presence of nature, a wild delight runs through a person in spite of real sorrows. Nature says, "You are my creature, and maugre all your impertinent griefs, you shall be glad with me." Not the sun or the summer alone, but every hour and season yields its tribute of delight, for every hour and change corresponds to and authorizes a different state of mind, from breathless noon to grimmest midnight. Nature is a setting that fits equally a comic or a mourning piece. In good health, the air is a cordial of incredible virtue, crossing a bare common, in snow puddles, at twilight, under a clouded sky, without having in my thoughts any occurrence of special good fortune. I have enjoyed a perfect exhilaration. I'm glad to the brink of fear. In the woods, too, a man casts off his years as the snake his slough, and what period soever of life is always a child. In the woods is perpetual youth. Within these plantations of God, a decorum and sanctity reign. A perennial festival is dressed, and the guest sees not how he should tire of them in 1,000 years. In the woods, we can return to reason and faith. There I feel that nothing can befall me in life, no disgrace, no calamity, which nature cannot repair. Thank you, Mr. Emerson, for these words which speak to us all these years later and which form part of the foundation of our UU faith today. Keep in mind, though, that Emerson also said that the power to produce this delight does not reside in nature, but in man. He believed that nature's value consisted of how we could use it, even if its use was to produce poetry and wisdom. Today, we take issue with Mr. Emerson over this point. We affirm that nature has intrinsic value of its own, and that rather than being the masters of nature, we are merely a clever but small part of a much larger whole. On Earth Day, we affirm that rather than to control nature or use it, it is a religious task for us to learn to cooperate with it. So today, I invite you to go outside, take a few deep breaths and feel the sunshine on your face. Maybe take some time to gaze at the flowers and leaf buds that are emerging, or even lay down on the grass and feel the earth supporting you from underneath. Speak your gratitude for this wonderful gift of life. Let yourself feel glad to the brink of fear as you become aware of the small but essential part you have to play in the interconnected web of all things, and then recommit to protecting this glorious and fragile world we share. Blessed be.
Well, good morning, and thank you for joining us here at the First Unitarian Church in our celebration of Earth Day. It's simply amazing that we are now celebrating the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. 50 years. And the 50th celebration of anything seems to invite a whole lot of nostalgia, doesn't it? And for me, in this case, I feel a little nostalgic about 50 years of Earth Days, and I remember so distinctly my very first Earth Day, obviously 50 years ago, when I was just finishing my junior year in college. This was in New York City, and the mantra of all the college kids in New York City at that time was, "Oh man, I gotta get out of the city. It's just messing my head. I gotta get out of the city." And this dovetailed so nicely with the message of the first Earth Day. Now, organizationally, it was kind of weak. The promotion was sketchy at best, and there was this vague talk about celebrating the earth. My goodness, what did that mean 50 years ago? It was time to get out and commune with nature and admire the flowers and hug a tree and all those things that, well, had some kind of appeal, but it just really wasn't rooted in anything very, very solid. But then again, with the mindset of, oh man, I got to get out of the city, a couple of friends and I decided that we would do exactly that on Earth Day and get out of the city. And now, you may not realize that just about an hour or an hour and a half, or somewhere between there, from New York City, just going straight north, the Appalachian Trail runs right through there. So it's that same Appalachian Trail that if you hike it from Georgia all the way to Maine, you got to get through part of New York, and that part in New York is just about 75 minutes north of Manhattan. It's called Harriman State Park, and in fact, I went with 4 other friends. We had never been there before, and we decided Earth Day would be a good time to try it out and, well, in the language of the Earth Day founders, take some time to commune with nature. And so we all hopped into an old van, no windows, so there were 2 in the front, and 3 of us kind of just sat on the floor of the van. It must have been a van from, the late 50s. It had standard transmission, 3 gears on the column, a lot of fun to drive. And so we made our way to Harriman State Park, to the Appalachian Trail. And we parked. There were very, very few cars, if any, in the parking lot at that time. And we made our way out of the van and took a deep breath. And it was beautiful. It was so woodsy and nice. And so we found the trailhead quite by accident because we were inexperienced, but the trailhead was obvious. And then we found ourselves on the Appalachian Trail on the very first Earth Day celebration. Now, we had gone about 50 feet, no more, when one of us, not I, reached into his pocket and brought out a little pipe and filled it with a little hash, put it to his lips, struck a match, and then suddenly we were engulfed in what felt like the biggest police raid of the century. It was like the sting of all stings. We were absolutely confounded by cops that were just jumping out of helicopters, cops jumping down from trees, cops hiding behind trees, walking around and surrounding all of us. We just froze. We could not imagine what was going on. And so there we were on this it was a beautiful, beautiful late morning Earth Day, totally surrounded by cops. We had not only not inhaled, it hasn't even touched our lips. And so the cops, they were looking at us and we were looking at them. And I think they may have realized they made a mistake because we were obviously good kids. And the cops must have seen that. Hey, what do we do? These are all good kids. 3 of us went to Queens College, 2 were in City College, and we were really good kids. And there was the longest silence. Nobody seemed to know what to do. when finally one cop said, "All right, you're all under arrest." Oh my goodness. So he said, "Follow me." Now there were no handcuffs. A couple of cops went with him, and we just followed him to the police car somewhere in the parking lot that we had not noticed before. 3 jumped in the back seat, 1 sat shotgun, and 1 drove that van, that old blue windowless van, to the police station, which was about, roughly 10 miles away. It was a very, very small town, and as we were driving, we were engaged in absolutely stimulating conversation with the cop. We were talking about Earth Day, what he thought it meant, what we thought it meant. He obviously didn't like the concept of Earth Day. We thought, well, that's a pretty cool idea. Or actually, this is 1970. I think we used the word groovy. This was kind of a groovy and novel experience. And so we finally got to the police station, and we all got out of the van. We were all there. And finally, one of the policemen said, "How much money do you have amongst all of you together?" And so we reached down in our torn jean pockets. These were real torn jeans, not the kind you buy at Nordstrom's. They were authentically torn jeans. Reached down deep in the pockets, and we came up. We had about $60. And so the cop said, "All right, I'm going to set bail for you at $65. I'm going to hold one of you here in jail. You can decide which one. And I'm just going to wait for you to bail that one person out." Well, we kind of just looked at each other. Didn't know that bail and being arrested worked in this kind of way. I think the cops just wanted to teach us kids a lesson. So who was going to stay behind and be in jail and get bailed out? But there's one fellow who said, "I don't care about a jail record. I'm a musician. What does it matter? I'm just going to, be this famous musician, and nobody's going to care about my record." And so the rest of us were kind of relieved that we had one person who was going to take the rap for us. And then we all piled back into the van and went down to New York to get $5, and then came all the way back up again to this small town in upstate New York. And when we got to the police station in this small town upstate, there he was, not in jail, but kind of hanging out with a whole bunch of enthusiastic cops listening to him perform on the guitar. Apparently one of the cops went to get a guitar and a pick and all that kind of stuff, and Dave was just entertaining them all. They all had a wonderful time, and I put down my $65, or we all put down our $65 to get poor Dave, who was really enjoying being the entertainer of the year at the police station. And we took him out and went back home. We were all kind of relieved and grateful to Dave for taking the rap. At that time, I thought that no church would ever call me to their ministry if I had a drug record. Although, come to think of it, in all the 3 years that I have, all the 3 churches that I have served over the many years of ministry, not one church ever asked, "Have you ever been arrested?" Oh, those Unitarians, I guess they just don't seem to care about those kinds of things. But anyway, we made our way back to New York. It was an interesting first Earth Day, and we kind of said to each other and promised each other that if there would be a second Earth Day, we would certainly plan it a little differently. We were certainly made a little the wiser for that experience. One postscript, though, to this story, and that is, how sometimes when you're with a group of people and there's this icebreaker game that you play and you have to reveal something about yourself that nobody else in the room would ever suspect. And so playing this game, when it's my turn, I mentioned to the group that I hiked the Appalachian Trail. Oh my goodness, people are just absolutely blown away. They thought it's terrific. And then the inevitable question comes out, "How far did you hike?" And I say, "Well, about 50 feet. Everybody decides we better leave it at that. And that's my memory of the first Earth Day, 1970.
Once again, thank you to all of you who have gotten in your pledge cards for next year's church budget and to those who have paid up your pledges for this year. In these precarious times, every pledge is a commitment to our church and its future, to our wonderful staff who are deeply committed to this church, and it's a commitment you make to one another. We'd love to wrap up this pledge campaign within the next short while, and we can't confirm our budget for next year without a pledge from each and every one of you. So if you haven't taken the time to make your pledge and your payment or your payment plan yet, please do that today. Thank you. I also have an exciting new announcement to share with you this week. Every year, Unitarian Universalist congregations from around the world come together for our annual General Assembly. And this year's GA is going to be entirely virtual for the first time ever. And that means that if you've always wanted to attend GA, this is your year. General Assembly will be held June 24th through June 28th, and the cost to attend virtually is only $150. That's a fraction of what it usually costs, especially when you factor in travel and entertainment and food. So please consider attending this important event. You can find the link for registration and more important details in your torch email. And do let me know if you decide to attend. I'd love for our congregation to have a big attendance. And now, the offering will gratefully be received while we aren't passing the plate or greeting our neighbors. This week, we are giving you time to use your Givelify app on your smartphone or tablet to make a donation to the virtual offering plate or to make your pledge at this time while David plays that familiar tune.
As a catastrophe of biblical proportion sweeps across the entire globe, we predictably search for explanations. And in order to fit the magnitude of the devastation that has inflicted the entire world with the right size cause for the harm, the leading candidate for instigating this whole mess is, of course, God. Who else? Only a supernatural power filled with wrath could unleash such enormous devastation. And for many religious leaders, God just happens to be the fall guy, the one who schemed this pandemic for the sake of retribution. Now, what I love about this point of view is that God always punishes the human race for the same complaints held by the indignant religious leader. If the religious person, for example, is inflamed by same-sex marriage, why then God feels exactly the same way and kills tens of thousands of people in a pandemic to prove the point. If the religious person opposes a woman's reproductive rights or is biased against immigrants, God obviously shares the same misogyny, xenophobia, and racist profile as the religious person who has grown irate about the lapsed morality so widespread throughout the land. However, as some religious leaders want to interpret catastrophe through God's eyes, who happens to share the same political lens as their own, other leaders are inclined to let God off the hook. And one such religious leader, I dare say a religious authority of the highest caliber, is Pope Francis I. He refuses to view God as a revenge monger because the Pope has evolved from pre-scientific biblical stories to embrace modern-day science. Why, even our Republican senators and House members, newly appointed Supreme Court justices, and the president of our country have yet reached that level of theological sophistication. They still break out in hives whenever facts supported by scientific data present themselves. The more facts we have, the less control nefarious minds can wield. Pope Francis I, and oddly, more Unitarian Universalists follow his lead than Roman Catholics. Well, anyway, Pope Francis regards the coronavirus as one of nature's responses to ignoring the harsh consequences of climate change. In other words, we're not dealing with an angry God, but we're dealing with a wounded natural world which suffers from our neglect as caretakers of our earth. Now, the Pope adds a very simple lesson that we can and should commit to memory. He says, God forgives always. People forgive sometimes. Nature forgives never. The Pope makes a most helpful distinction. After citing the fires in Australia, the glaciers melting in Antarctica, the floods, the extinctions of an endless number of species, I mean, you know, the whole litany, he says these are not nature's way of revenge, but we must definitely consider this all nature's response. How refreshing it is to hear a leading prelate dismiss the very idea that God or nature are vengeful, seeking to get even with the human race. Instead, what we experience during this COVID-19 virus is nature's response to our failures to heed the cries of the earth. Our president has framed the issue succinctly. It's either the economy or human life, as though the two were mutually exclusive. Pope Francis, on the other hand, speaks of an opportunity for the economy now to be less liquid and more human. The economy now can be less liquid, more human. Wow. Imagine that. The Pope has weighed in on our global predicament with a humble observation. He said, and I quote him, "I believe we have to slow down our rate of production and consumption and to learn to understand, reconnect with, and contemplate the natural world." Well, if I'm not mistaken, I think the Pope just took out a page from Walden Pond by Henry David Thoreau. Really, that's what it sounds like to me. And for the past 50 years, Earth Day messages have really presented that there is this profound need to understand, reconnect with, and contemplate the natural world. Essentially, we have, well, what's the word? Forsaken. We have forsaken the earth, our home, for personal gain. That's really it in a nutshell. And the Pope reminds us, he says, hey guys, you can't do that. There are consequences for neglecting our responsibilities to this earth. I have come to look upon Earth Day, the last 20 years or so, as a day of confession. Enumerating my sins could not fit in a single sermon. My guilt haunts me whenever I engage in unsustainable activities and self-indulging habits. Earth Day shouts at me, much like the eco-theologian Sally McFaig shouted at everybody when she said, "Who do you think you are? Who do you think you are?" Now, I understand this question not as simply rhetorical, implying that we have assumed too much self-centeredness in the natural order, but I see the question as a moral test for our capacity to coexist with other species and with our brothers and sisters who have been denied leading a privileged life like so many of us. It's a moral test that will determine how intentionally I act, as caretaker of my mother, the earth from whom all life flows. Am I denying my mother the joy of nurturing her progeny? How can I, in good conscience, just walk away from my ailing mother? This Earth Day has been most remarkable in that after 50 years of pedantic lectures on climate change, conferences on climate change, sit-ins and teach-ins, walkouts, walk-ins, demonstrations, rallies at a fevered pitch, a picture has now finally emerged worth more than 1 million lectures pointing to our greed, consumerism, and exploitation of the earth. Because the pandemic has interrupted the flow of manufacturing and cars and trucks and planes and farming and carbon footprints left by humans and industry, suddenly now, a picture emerges that makes it all so clear what all these 50 years of protest have tried to demonstrate. For the first time in many, many decades, we can see the entire Himalaya mountains. For the first time in decades upon decades, the air in New Delhi, India, is clear. People can breathe without choking. The air in China is strikingly clean. In Venice, the canals are clean. In Seattle, New York, LA, Chicago, the pollution has lifted. Global carbon emissions have fallen. The use of fossil fuels greatly reduced. It took a pandemic of frightening proportion to get us to stop. Get us to stop the madness, stop the self-absorption, stop the greed. Stop and notice the inequities in healthcare, the income disparities, the torment of the earth, a living organism dying by our own hands. Nature did not intend to exact revenge. It merely responded to the human hunger for more and more resources embedded in the earth. In the grab for accumulation, human beings have destroyed ecohabitats and exposed them to unknown pathogens. Ebola and many previous forms of the coronavirus were triggered by a jump from animals to humans in disturbed natural habitats. This is all we have. We have the scientific evidence now. Nature responded. Of course it did. There was no other recourse. So yeah, it's time to reconnect with the natural world. You know, for the past 50 years, Earth Day has implored us to change our habits of greed. Did we really listen? I don't know. But I think something might have changed on this, the 50th anniversary. Now, for the past 5+ weeks, the virus has grinded our habits to a halt. Its many inherent lessons learned during this period of quiet, that means non-consumerism, not driving, not traveling, simply being. The lessons reverberate with decades worth of dripping Earth Day messages. And central to it all, I believe, is recognizing that the environment, the economy, the political are all wrapped tightly around the same thread. The thread that ultimately will move us in new directions or, perversely, have us repeat the errors of the past. This thread is deeply embedded in moral philosophy. In this scary time, when far too many people have died and suffered, while simultaneously the earth healed itself from its wounds, are we ready to take into account the need to align a new morality with new patterns of living once the virus has passed? The environmentalist David Orr from Oberlin College says that we need people of moral courage to make the world more habitable and human. People of moral courage to make the world more habitable and human. I mean, wow. Is that not the essence of environmentalism and 50 years worth of Earth days? Isn't that it? Doesn't that sum it up? To make the world more habitable and humane. The moral courage required entails a rethinking, re-examining, redoing our lifestyles, priorities, values, commensurate with making the world more habitable. Minimally, it involves consumerism and figuring out, what do we really need? We've come a lot closer during the time of this pandemic in terms of what do we really need. And it also entails long-distance travel and an honest inquiry to how often do we really need to travel? Moral courage is required to examine, well, most simplistically, how do we live? How do we live? How do we intend to go forth in ways of living? And honestly, we must evaluate how much of our lifestyle is really, and I can't think of any other word, how much of our lifestyle is really irresponsible. It's a tough word, but let's be honest. I think it's the right word that fits perfectly here. Don't we act irresponsibly? Are we lacking the courage to make the needed changes? Is making the world more habitable really and truly on our radar? I mean, maybe somehow distantly it is, but is it really upfront, real, and personal? That we, because only we can do this, make the world more habitable. And so this is a time of crisis and opportunity. Now, as we consider ourselves religious beings, by virtue of our affiliation with the First Unitarian Church, we fortunately do not engage in theological speculation about who is punishing whom for what. Instead, as people who take religion seriously, we must grapple with the meaning of all that has come to light. We must acknowledge, especially after learning from visual evidence, how humans have contributed to the climate crisis. We must acknowledge now that profound courage must be tapped to finally alter the whole moral landscape of how we lead our lives. It would be a pity, wouldn't it, if we just waited for the virus to pass and then resumed business as usual. Have we not been changed these past few weeks by witnessing, wow, so much? What immediately comes to mind are all the heroes, these selfless heroes that are part of the medical personnel and, of course, the first responders. Have we not learned in this time to really appreciate our friends and family so much more deeply? Have we not learned of our global interconnectedness? Have we learned that firsthand? And the tragic consequences to our earth when we feel compelled to exceed our needs. This is a time where we must examine our own moral compass. We must examine our capacity to change the economics and the politics that drive a wedge between us and the earth, between us and our brothers and sisters. On the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, I think we understand our predicament more clearly than ever before. If all these deaths and suffering are to hold any meaning at all, we must recalibrate our moral barometer and live our lives with the courage to make the world more habitable and humane. Yeah. Earth Day, 50 years. I think we've learned a lot.
Please join us now in our closing hymn, hymn number 187. We're only going to sing 2 verses. The words and music should post up on your screen, so you can pick whatever 2 you would like to sing.
In closing, I'd like to refer back to the words of David Orr. He says that the plain fact is that the planet does not need more successful people, but it does desperately need more peacemakers, healers, restorers, storytellers, and lovers of every kind. It needs people who live well in their places. And these qualities have little to do with success as our culture has defined it. Amen.